Good evening and welcome to The Right Divide. I'm Scott Ganser, pastor of Kingdom of God Fellowship in Fenton, Missouri, and we're going through an in-depth exploration of the Bible. Now, it never is too frequent that we can look back at this, which is the Metanarrative of the Bible, the overarching theme in God's redemptive plan, and we're at the beginning stages. So we're going through points 1 and 2, creation, fall, redemption is in the future. So we ended last time with an expulsion from the Garden of Eden, or Gan Eden, because man fell. Man fell from grace, his exalted, pristine position in the world and with God. We did not keep up our end of the bargain. What bargain is that? There was an Edenic or Adamic covenant, if you will. And covenants are serious business. It's been said that covenants are more intimate than a relationship and more binding than any contract. And to enact a covenant at this time and in this place, there were rituals to really solidify the agreement. And in the ritual, there are these elements. So these don't all have to be there, but you'd probably see at least a few. The first one are the promises. Each side in a covenant has some interests they either want to protect or promote, and the promises will have to do with those interests. So each one has something that they can offer the other. So it's an exchange, so to speak. So there are promises. The second one, and this is more to do with the ritual, is the blood sacrifice, which also speaks to the seriousness of the matter at hand. Some animal is going to lose its life for this ritual to come about. So there's a blood sacrifice often in the makings of covenants. And then following that is the blood path. One of the more visually stunning ones is the Abrahamic covenant, where Abram is charged with the task to prepare for this. And so what he had to do is he had to gather a series of animals. Those animals had to die, and he would align the side of something like a ditch so that the blood would kind of flow through a stream, and there are pieces of the animals that lost their lives on either side. And those who were making the covenant were charged with walking through that. The point being that if anyone breaks this or lets down their portion of it, what happened to the animals can easily happen to them. There's mingling of blood. Sometimes, you've seen these movies where two guys form a pact and they become blood brothers, or they might cut their hands and clasp hands, so there might be some mingling of human blood there. Change of names, again referring to Abraham. He wasn't always Abraham. Originally it was Abram, and then once God enacted this covenant, he changed his name to Abraham because he was going to become the father of nations. Father of nations. Exchange of gifts. We don't see that too frequently. I'm not going to refer to that right now. But some examples are weapons, belts, garments, some of their personal effects, something that means something to each person entering this covenant. And something that we saw before Israel, the nation, Medinat Yisrael, the nation of Israel, was inaugurated, God laid down the law. Literally, there were 10 commandments given. And there was this ratifying covenant meal that the elders of Israel partook in before there was any entrance into the land. It was the promised land. Point number 1, promised land. And lastly, there were witnesses, people who weren't parties in the covenant, they were there on hand to see, or else something like a monument could be established that would testify to the historicity of what just occurred. So those are some of the elements of covenants in the ancient world. Now, man was enticed to fall from grace. Adam and Eve knew better. They were given notice and opportunity to keep their end of the bargain, the end of the covenant, but they were enticed by Satan, Lucifer, and they believed him rather than God, and the consequences of that were a rupture in the relationship with God, loss of paradise, Gan Eden is paradise, and then expulsion from the garden. The man would have increased toil, the woman would have pain in childbirth, and life was going to get much rougher for them. And they were going to become mortal. Initially, I don't believe that was God's plan, that we would live forever. But dying, you shall die. That was part of the curse. So, we hearken back to the expulsion in the garden. God made sure that this was going to take, and he planted or positioned 2 cherubim, 2 of these powerful angels, to protect man from re-entering the garden. But here we can see it on display. Now, falling from grace can be inspirational. How so? Well, there are 2 modern classics that use the expulsion and what happened immediately after source material. The first one, maybe you've heard of, it's called Paradise Lost by John Milton. Interestingly, this book is written from the point of view of Satan. And if you would imagine someone penning his own book, he isn't going to be the bad guy. But this is written from the point of view of Satan, and it begins in hell. And then Satan learns that God is creating this world, this wonderful, beautiful world with new inhabitants, human beings. And he embarks on this journey. He launches from this conference center that's built in hell called Pandemonium. And he embarks on this journey to basically besmirch God's new creation. He's jealous, he's envious, he's up to no good, and what he ends up doing, of course, is enticing Adam and Eve, and they fell. Now, one of the things, you can see a contrast here, God made human beings in his own image. We're to have dominion over the earth, over the animals. We're supposed to be moral, virtuous human beings, holy, holy, holy. And we lost that holiness, at least, in our rebellion against God and our mistrust of God. So, when we fell, we became somewhat like the image of Satan. We were more like him in our behavior, and this really God isn't going to put up with, which launches his redemption plan that includes Jesus, centers on Jesus. So that is Paradise Lost, and its source material is the expulsion from Eden. Now, after Eden, the first couple had to go somewhere. So where'd they go? They went east of Eden. Well, this east of Eden is Salinas, California. It's not exactly the same east of Eden that we have in the Bible, but again, we're seeing the Bible used as source material for some very powerful stories. And here we have 2 brothers who you can see are in the likeness of Cain and Abel, and they're vying for the attention of their father. And that's going to lead to some dire and desperate consequences, some things that you wouldn't want to have headlining any newspaper. Now, we've seen Milton and Steinbeck pen their own books on the expulsion and life after the fall and Eden. They weren't the only ones who got creative. There's a story that is part of the Haggadah. Now I'm going to wax Jewish for a moment here, so I hope you bear with me. In the Jewish religion, you have rabbis and you have priests and you have an assortment of officials and so forth, but you also have stories. So these aren't meant to be factual stories. They're meant to entertain and then maybe to help explain some things, or this one is to promote the excellency of one particular rabbi. So this has to do with Eden and the expulsion from Eden. However, it doesn't involve Adam and Eve, it doesn't involve Cain and Abel, it doesn't involve Lucifer. It involves 4 rabbis. These are the rabbis. We have Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, which means other. And then we have Rabbi Akiva. So keep your eyes on Rabbi Akiva, because this story is mostly about him. And it begins with them meditating and praying and the use of the divine name. So they're using God's divine name, his personal name, and when they do, they enter the orchard. But the orchard is a code name for paradise or Eden. So they enter Eden, something that man is banned from entering. Now what happens? You know, something very interesting is going to happen here. So the first one we have is Ben Azai. Ben Azai enters Eden, he gazes, and he dies. He immediately dies. So death was what had happened for him. Then we have Ben Zoma. Ben Zoma doesn't die, but when he gazes, he loses his mind. He goes crazy. It is overwhelming for him. And then we have Acher, which means other. He doesn't die, he doesn't go crazy, but he does become a heretic. So he is at least harmed in the transaction here. And it's written of Rabbi Akiva that he gazed, he looked, he entered in peace, and he left in peace. Meaning nothing bad happened to him. He could take Eden as it was, and it didn't mar him. So this was meant to support the ministry of Akiva and basically promote him above all the others, and he became the sage for his particular age. So again, using the source material of Genesis. All right, now, moving along here. What happens after Eden? Well, there are 2 brothers. Probably a lot of you will know this story, Cain and Abel. And Cain meant to gain favor with God by offering a sacrifice, and the same with his brother Abel. But Cain's was not accepted, Abel's was, and this led to the first murder, the first fratricide, a killing of one brother by another. And God was not pleased. He had confronted Cain beforehand. He asked him, well, why has your countenance fallen? You know how to do well. Sin is crouching at your door, but you must master it. So he's giving him notice and opportunity once more so that nothing bad happens, but it does anyway. So it's a premeditated murder. Then afterward, another son arises. There are quite a few Christians who forget about the third son. His name is Seth. Seth is very important because from him, many of, for lack of a better word, the good people, the faithful people of God emerge, and from Cain, the unfaithful people of God emerge. And you can follow these 2 lines in Genesis. So 2 separate lines of people start developing, one from Seth, one from Abel. And then there's a text that has to do with the Nephilim. Nephilim means fallen ones. The Nephilim had relations with the sons of men. Now some people take this to mean that there were fallen angels who were mixing with human beings and giving rise to some physically tremendous people, standout people, and others take this to mean that the two lines, one from Cain, one from Abel, which were, Cain and Seth, which were separate, began to mix. And from that, the world became exceedingly corrupt. There was this tremendous expansion of evil and sin, which would lead to God wiping out the earth through the flood. And this was the deluge. It was a worldwide flood, not some local event. So this is the deluge that God brought about. Now this is what God said when he overlooked his creation. When the Lord saw that man's wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every scheme his mind thought of was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. This isn't what God wanted. This isn't what he desired. Then the Lord said, I will wipe off the face of the earth man whom I created, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Noah, however, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So there was one holdout, Noah. You might think I'm mispronouncing that. I'm not. Noah with a het is a man's name. Noah with a hey is a woman's name. It's like Sam and Samantha. So if you're hearing Noah, that's incorrect. That's not how it's said. So Noah found favor in the Lord. If God hadn't found someone whom he would favored, it would have been a complete disaster. So God said he's not going to contend with man forever. And the time frame given was 120 years. This can be misunderstood. And there's an interesting happenstance that it can be equated to. For the most part, human beings have the life expectancy at a high end of 120 years. That isn't really what's going on here. It's 120 years from when God made his pronouncement until the flood. So we're going to take a look at that. 120 years from when God made that pronouncement until the flood. And God is going to do a reset. He's going to basically start all over again with 8 people. All right, let's take a look at the 120 years. What does God mean by that? Okay, this is a chart from creation, or Answers in Genesis, which is a really good resource. Okay, so we have 120 years God is making his pronouncement because man, every thought of his heart is evil constantly, continually. It's almost as if good were entirely quenched. So this is when this pronouncement is made in Genesis 6:3. And then Noah has his sons. So Japheth, Ham, Shem, all of these guys. When he's 500 years old. So the lifespan of human beings was exceedingly longer than it is now. Methuselah, of course, is the longest lived human being, exceeding 900 years. So Noah has his sons beginning at 500 years old. And then we see a few things happen here. But the upshot is that Noah is to prepare for this because he's meant to survive the deluge. So this ark, which if you look at the dimensions of it, it would equate to the capacity of 500 boxcars that a train consists of. That's a huge capacity. You're wondering how all these animals fit in it? Because it's enormous. That's why. It's just huge. So that whole construction took, they have it, between 55 and 75 years. Some people say 120, 200 years. No. If you look at the timeline, that's what it is. About 55 to 75 years. And then he would start all over again. Now, this flood the rain continued for 40 days and 40 nights. It may or may not be literal. There is water coming from everywhere, even from the depths, even from below the earth. And then the whole earth was just inundated. God is going to start over, so he's wiping the slate clean. So what happens afterward? It takes them about a year. So they're out on this ark for about a year because the waters came up, they had to recede, and they had to land on something, dry land, so the waters had to recede, and it took it so long for that to happen. So what happens then? God makes a covenant once again. And it has the same elements, because God doesn't change, that he had in the beginning with Adam. To behave as God would have them behave, to walk faithfully before God, not be filled with violence like they were before the flood. That's why these people had to go. And to be fruitful, multiply the earth, and represent God well upon the earth. Be God's representative on the earth. And this happened to a certain degree, and to a certain degree it did not. We come later to the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, which seems like pre-flood instances. So man really has some reckoning to coming to him, except God has an intercessor. There was an intercessor in the garden, which meant bad or evil for man. This other intercessor, God's Son, meant good for man, and he would bring it about through his own death. And if you look at the Abrahamic covenant, Abram didn't participate. Very interesting. Do you see Abram in the Bible walk through that blood path? No, he was asleep. He was sound asleep. But a covenant was made. So who made it? Well, God was one of the parties. And if we're looking at our soteriology, which is basically our theology of salvation, it was Jesus. There was an oven and a torch. And those represented the two parties who made this covenant. So we didn't keep our end of the bargain again. Jesus paid the price. And we can be eternally thankful. Otherwise, we would be lost. Everything would be lost. Not just paradise, everything. Here's where we have an example of when knowing the Bible well can really matter. And in terms of our own evangelism, we're meant to tell people about God and the story of God. Now, the flood has been made into movies. One of the more recent installments was by a filmmaker named Darren Aronofsky. Now, this was a terrible, terrible movie. I saw it. I wanted to leave the theater. It was so far from what we see in the Bible, and it turned a lot of the themes on its head. My God is Lord. And in this film, he abdicates his throne and lets Noah decide whether or not humanity would have a future. So it's left entirely up to Noah. And in the film, Noah is not a likable person. The Bible says that he's blameless, he's a tzaddik, he's someone who we can admire. In the film, we couldn't admire him at all. I wouldn't want to be in the same room as this individual. But this is how Aronofsky envisioned Noah. There were rock monsters in this movie. There's not rock monsters in the Bible. Evil was pretty well portrayed. Man was just violent and vile, and it just looked like we'd lost our minds. So there was some faithfulness there. And then the world started all over again. But we can speak well of the elements that are faithful to the Bible, and we can point people to the real God and to Jesus, who are both caring and sacrificial. They make sacrifices for us. And we shouldn't ever lose sight of that. Now at the end of the deluge, God does an interesting thing. He makes a new covenant. He doesn't completely forsake man. And he gives us a sign, which is another one of the elements of a covenant. And the sign that he gives us is the rainbow. The Hebrew word for rainbow is keshet, and he hangs it like such. So the ark or the arch is pointed up. I'm from St. Louis, I should get that right. However, this is to sign that he's putting away his weapon of war. He's retiring that. He is never ever going to do this again. Now, he didn't do it just to man. He wiped out all flesh. That's what the Bible says. Because of man. The animals didn't go awry. We did. And God does a reset, and he makes this unilateral agreement. So nothing that we can do is going to take away from what God has established here. And that's a wonderful thing, that we can't incur God's wrath in the same way, which speaks volumes to the character of God, which we should always keep our focus on. That's one of the things that Satan really was effective in, and that was causing human beings to lose their focus. And when we are believers, when we believe the Bible, we believe the character and goodness of God, who created a good world for us to be good in. This is a recurring theme again and again and again. Everything is wonderful. That would be perfect. That would be paradise. But we can see the story, the narrative continuing on, because God is still interested in man. We're still in the image of God, and he is going to embark on this restoration, reconciliation plan that is richer than anything we could have come up with on our own. So stay tuned for that. This is Scott Ganzer. Hope to see you next week.